Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2022 annual Sacred Trust Talks and Book Signing event presented by the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park. We are pleased to collaborate with the Foundation to invite renowned Civil War historians, authors, National Park rangers, licensed battlefield guides, and experts to participate in the Sacred Trust to share their unique perspectives with our visitors. Our next speaker, Dr. Scott Hancock, will lay out how the stories of the Underground Railroad were indeed quite dramatic, even more so because they reveal how and why the nation fought a devastating war and continues to struggle to tell a more complete story of that war. Dr. Scott Hancock is an associate professor of history and Africana studies at Gettysburg College. After spending 14 years working with teenagers in crisis, he switched careers and received a PhD in early American history in 1999. These two careers fuel his desire to tell stories of people whom society and history have often discounted as troublesome and unimportant, such as black women, men, and children who sought to escape slavery in antebellum America. Dr. Hancock joins historians who now see the Underground Railroad as one of the primary causes of the American Civil War and national emancipation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Hancock.
Good afternoon. Okay, so we're going to start with a little pop quiz. So, who won the Civil War? No. The United States. Okay, how you doing now? Second question, who freed the slaves? Themselves. Black people. Well, we might as well go home. Not Lincoln, the Union Army, abolitionists, a lot of people. Okay, so we'll think through that and how those stories have been told or have not been told, ways we can do that. So in 2017, on July 1st, this was the image on the Union side of the battlefield, the Sons of Confederate Veterans celebrating by pledging allegiance to the Confederate battle flag. And can you imagine how Union veterans who were okay with the installation of the Virginia Monument in 1917, but were not okay with the Confederate battle flag being on it, that's why it's a Virginia state flag, how they would have reacted to this. And by the way, the reason the SCV did this is because that's where the First Amendment exercise area is, so they were doing what the park, they were abiding by what the park asked them to do. But the symbolism, I think, of this being on the Union side suggests that Confederates and their ancestors have won the battle for the minds and hearts of America. So several years ago, Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, one of the Little Rock Nine, came here to the visitor center. And one of the things that she said has stuck with me. She said, "Ordinary people do extraordinary things, like the people in this painting." So this is The Ride for Liberty, The Fugitive Slaves by Eastman Johnson. According to the Brooklyn Museum, Johnson claimed to have based his subject on an actual event he witnessed near the Manassas, Virginia battlefield on March 2nd, 1862. One of the unique aspects of this painting is there are no white people in it. These African Americans are the independent agents of their own freedom from circumstances of enslavement, of being pursued by law enforcement, slave catchers, and slave owners as they escape from slavery and run to freedom. So the question I'd like to explore today is how people like this, like these three people, who are arguably the weakest people in the country in the terms of social, political, military, and legal power, how they become a weapon that starts a war that ends their own enslavement. So in order to do that, I'm going to go backward in time. I'm going to tell you three stories. One of a Washington, D.C. statue that was dedicated in 1876. One of a father and son who fought at Gettysburg in 1863. And of a black woman in 1847 who exemplifies the reason why that father and son were here at Gettysburg and why there's a statue of a black man and Lincoln in our nation's capital. But before I get to these stories, just a word on why stories matter. So the Akan people of what's in today Ghana, basically Ghana, they sum this up in one word called Sankofa. And so in some one way to illustrate that in some Western African societies, Western Central African societies, there used to be a kind of ritual form of insult where you told somebody, particularly a man, you don't know your history. And if you received that insult, the way you responded was by reciting your family history in front of your neighborhood audience. And you had to know the stories of your ancestors for at least 7 generations back from memory. So you had to know who they, can anybody do that? Okay. All right, good. You had to know who they were, what they did, why they mattered, and why what they did mattered. So it's more than just knowing a family tree. So in these African towns, if you did not know your history, you did not know who you were. And if you didn't know who you were, you didn't know how you got to where you are, you did not deserve respect. Why should anybody listen to somebody who doesn't understand why things are the way they are? How can such a person have answers for the challenges of the present or the future? But if you knew your history, you understood how and why society works the way it does, you'd be a benefit to your family and to your community. You were a Sankofa person who knew the past while moving forward with grace, wisdom, and confidence. You deserve respect. So, today, let's be a Sankofa people. And here's how we do it, by knowing what happened, why it happened, and why it matters. So we know enslaved people ran away. Why did it matter that they did? And I'm going to skip briefly to the South Carolina monument here at Gettysburg. And this is the story that it tells. So this inscription, if you can read that from there, it says, "The men of honor might forever know the responsibilities of freedom, dedicated South Carolinians stood and were counted for their heritage and convictions, abiding faith in the sacredness of states' rights, provided their creed." Okay, so we'll keep that in mind. So for the South Carolina monument, the why is states' rights. So let's go back to escaping enslaved black women, men, and children. And by the way, I used the word escaping intentionally. Black folks ran away for all kinds of reasons. The vast majority not to escape to permanent freedom, to leverage against their owner, to escape punishment, aka torture, to see family, sometimes to be marooned, building communities in places like the Great Dismal Swamp, which used to be a lot bigger, for months or years. But a small percentage escape to seek permanent freedom in places like the North. So escaping slave stories have often been told like this. So this is a statue in D.C., in Lincoln Park. This is Archer Alexander, depicted here rising from his knees under Lincoln's guidance or permission. He was the last person caught in Missouri under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And so the featured speaker at this dedication is Frederick Douglass. There's about 25,000 people, and there are senators and Supreme Court justices, so it's a pretty powerful crowd. So I'm going to read you at length some of Frederick Douglass's quotes. Some historians have read his speech as honoring Lincoln. I think there's more going on than that, and as others, not just me. So Douglass says, "We fully comprehend the relation of Lincoln both to ourselves and to the white people of the United States. It must be admitted, truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Lincoln was not either our man or our model. In his interest, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity and the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. He was willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master, to suppress a slave rising for his liberty." I mean, you don't get a much more direct indictment of this statue than that. "Our faith in him was often taxed and strained to the uttermost, but it never failed. When he tarried long in the mountain, when he strangely told us we were the cause of the war, when he still more strangely told us to leave the land in which we were born, when he refused to employ our arms in defense of the Union, when, after accepting our services as colored soldiers, he refused to retaliate our murder and torture as colored prisoners, when he told us he would save the Union if he could with slavery, when he revoked the proclamation of emancipation of General Fremont, when we saw all this and more, we were at times grieved, stunned, and greatly bewildered, but our hearts believed while they ached and bled." So Douglas is telling that huge audience a Sankofa story, a different story than what the statue told, a story in which Archer Alexander's blackness spoke to the importance of Lincoln in the fight for freedom while simultaneously criticizing Lincoln. And Douglas did then go on to have a more praiseworthy speech of Lincoln. That's how he opened. The Lincoln statue did not make black people disappear, but it did minimize their role. So the Virginia State Monument at Gettysburg goes further. So let's think about the stories that are told from this monument. Now, Gettysburg National Military Park, I would argue, has done and is doing a great deal to construct a narrative that is deeply grounded in solid history. You know, the museum here tells a very different story than the commemorative landscape. There's the military park student guide to Pickett's Charge, for instance, makes absolutely clear that this war was about slavery. But when you're on the landscape, black people largely disappear. I'd say until this spring, they disappeared completely. North Carolina Monument, a brief aside, when I was riding my bike by this march, I noticed the sign says War for Memory and says slavery. And talking to Christopher Gwynn, I asked him if, as far as I knew, this was the first wayside marker on the battlefield landscape that had the word slavery. And he couldn't think of another one before then. And so I said, the park, you know, they're working on this. But we got a ways to go. So last summer, July 4th, I was riding my bike, had just come back from a tour through the South, was riding my bike by the monument and saw this huge crowd. And so I stopped and I asked somebody what was going on. And it was a free of charge walk across battlefield with a park ranger as a guide. And so even though I was wearing my shirt from the Nashville African American History Museum that said Black and Proud from James Brown's song, even though I was going to be surrounded by 350 white folks, it's free. So, you know, I went. So the ranger did absolutely nothing to glorify or sanctify the war, the charge. He was fantastic in his storytelling, told us about the strategy, the challenges. It was an outstanding experience. One of the stories he told at the very start, for the first 45 minutes while you're standing under the monument, was a story of Lee, Traveler, the 7 men that are the base of the monument who represent the humanity of Virginia's Confederate soldiers. And he told the story of 28th Virginia Regiment Captain Michael Spessard. And Spessard, it's an incredibly human, moving story that he has. He told us, this park ranger, how who wasn't from Gettysburg, how Spessard's son Hezekiah was also in the 28th Infantry under his father's command. The charge across the field had barely begun when Hezekiah was hit by enemy fire. And apparently, from a much later accounting, Captain Spessard either saw this happen or came across his son laying there right afterwards. And the record says, "Look at my poor boy, Colonel," he said to another soldier, before then rejoining the charge. Park historian John Heiser research shows that Hezekiah was taken to a field hospital where he died on July 19th. His father may not have been able to find him. Apparently, he was not able to find him. He may not have even known what happened to him until he got a letter from his wife saying that his son had died at the end of July. I can't imagine what that would be like. And we need to know these stories, right? All human life, I would argue, whether regardless of the cause they're fighting for, is valuable, and the loss of it is tragic. But, so as I listened to this ranger tell the story at the Virginia Monument, and then he bookended the walk as we got to the high water mark by talking about the importance of human life and the tragedy and horror of war, what struck me is that over 4 hours, there was no mention of why the Spessards were there in the first place. Why Captain Spessard was leading the 28th Virginia, no mention of why Hezekiah signed up. The word slavery, enslaved people, none of that was ever mentioned. So this made me curious. So I went home, got on my bike, rode home, did a little initial research, took me about 90 minutes online, learned that Captain Spessard was indeed an enslaver of one person. He likely, and his father, enslaved 8 people. His father had likely inherited Elias, Susan, Stephen, Matilda, and Jean from his own father. These enslaved people were among the 12% of enslaved people in Craig County, Virginia. And that doesn't seem like a lot, 12%, but only one other of the 138 counties of Virginia was smaller than Craig County and had a higher percentage of population as slaves. Most Shenandoah counties were not like Robert E. Lee's county, where he and his wife owned 189 enslaved people. And regardless, though, slave owning meant something in Craig County, particularly when you owned 8 people. So Captain Michael Spessard had to know the significance of enslaving black people. And so that's the context, I would argue, and others, that when Captain Spessard wrote in the 1862 letter that the South was fighting against an enemy that would, quote, invade our home and confiscate our property, unquote, he probably meant livestock and land and human beings. So on that Pickett's Charge walk, black people, whether it's being enslaved by the men walking, charging, fighting, killing, and dying on that field, or enslaved as laborers in Robert E. Lee's army, completely disappeared. So Craig County lies at the southern end of the Shenandoah Valley. Many of those counties north of the Spessard's home were majority black populations, and W.B. Du Bois called them the Great Black Way, and he said along its stretch, swamps and rivers and forests and crests of the Alleghanies, a widening, hurrying stream of fugitives swept to the havens of refuge, taking the restless, the criminal, and the unconquered, the natural leaders. These men saved slavery and killed it. They destroyed it by presenting themselves before the eyes of the North and the world as living specimens of the real meaning of slavery. They saved it too by joining the free Negroes of the North and with them organizing themselves into a great black phalanx that worked and schemed and paid and finally fought for the freedom of black men in America. So this is the Great Black Way that he's talking about. So you can see the mountain range going along the Shenandoah Valley, up into the Shenandoah Valley, and Craig County sits just on the east side of that range. So growing up along the Great Black Way and as part of an army that had to police the thousands of enslaved workers that it brought to Gettysburg to make sure they didn't run away, as part of an army that had orders to kidnap free black people in Pennsylvania and take them back into slavery, Spessard very probably knew of the widening, hurrying stream of black people looking to escape. He would have certainly known about the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which was widely reported in Virginia papers. He would have known about the process of employing slave catchers to pursue escaping slaves. And let's see. For time's sake, just to make sure, I'm going to skip this, but I can come back to it if we have enough time. So when slave catchers, well, actually, I'll mention this last about Tom and Susan in a minute. So when slave catchers and slave owners chase black women, men, and children, when the slave owner and enslaved person relationship comes into the northern spaces where slavery has disappeared, it has a different meaning. So many Northerners, even some unsympathetic to slaves, no longer believe owners can do the same things that they did in the southern spaces, right? It's a legal relationship in those southern spaces, but when you come into the northern states, it changes it. So here's my somewhat, all analogies break down if you press them too hard, so don't push me on this too much. But my somewhat risque analogy, so if you are, at any point in American history, as far as I know, if you're legally married, you can have marital relations with your spouse in any part of your house that you want, or the barn, or anything that's your property. But you can't do that in Starbucks, right? It's a legal act, but depending on the space, what it means and how the law sees it can change. And so Northerners are starting to understand this relationship between the enslaved and the slave owner differently through the antebellum era when that relationship comes into northern spaces. So that space matters. So for instance, this example of Tom and Susan, 1797, they run away, they're married. They run away from their master in Rhode Island to Massachusetts, which had more or less ended slavery in 1780. So Tom finds work near Worcester, Mass. Susan works as a nurse in a smallpox hospital. Their owner's son tracks them down. They had hid, apparently, with the assistance of sympathetic whites and probably some free black folks. The owner said, as federal law is clear, quote, as federal law is clear against any person either concealing or harboring fugitives, unquote, he wants to pursue the case in court. So what Tom and Susan did, as well as their own responses, was nearly identical to hundreds and thousands of cases in the 1820s and 30s and 40s and 50s It doesn't cause any of the furor in 1797, those later cases would. It was a legal issue only. It didn't involve any sectional issues. Rhode Island didn't threaten to leave the Union because of lax enforcement. There were no geographic divides. Rhode Islanders didn't perceive their way of life and liberties to be at risk because Tom and Susan weren't being pursued by the federal or state governments. It didn't lead to any deep divisions on identity. Rhode Islanders didn't see themselves as fundamentally different from the Massachusetts residents. By contrast, 50 years later, when Hester and 2 other slaves run away from the owners in Hagerstown, Maryland to Carlisle, PA, it causes a riot. It leads to 28 free black men being in prison, court trials, at least 1 death, and all kinds of passionate rhetoric. And there'll be more on her later. So what changed? And part of what changes is once slavery disappears from the states north of the Mason-Dixon line, when African Americans decide to escape, they transform that relationship with their owners. They transform the significance of the spaces on each side of the border. They help transform how Northerners and Southerners are starting to think of each other. And this is an 1888 map called Historical Geography that I think typifies the way Americans for a long time began to think of the North and South. My wife was born in Connecticut. She said she grew up, we were both born in 1961. She said she grew up thinking, no, the North is good. The North is morally good. The South, oh, that's evil. We know it's more complicated than that, right? But this kind of map, which you can find at the Library of Congress, John F. Smith's Historical Geography map, is fascinating. This kind of map hides that kind of complexity. So I've used a metaphor of a fault line to get at this, an ideological, legal, geographical, and political fault line. So a geographical fault line is a place where 2 of the Earth plates are in tension with one another, as one is pushing up against the other. And when the tension becomes too great, explosive force is released, right? And one plate slips up above the other and you get massive earthquakes. So freedom's fault line is the border between the northern and southern states, most dramatically represented by the Mason-Dixon line, I think about 8 miles south of here as the crow flies. And different conceptions of what freedom meant, for whom it was meant, coalesce on each side of the border throughout the first half of the 19th century. Geography and law began exerting pressure on that fault line from the nation's founding, as slavery comes to be understood increasingly as a Southern institution. It belongs in a particular geographical space. But those physical spaces' meaning don't result from a legal epiphany that declares every place north of the line free, every place south unfree. It comes into focus gradually, but it carries powerful meaning to step from one of those stone markers, the Mason-Dixon line, from the south side to the north side. Harriet Tubman was recorded as saying, when I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. So the Underground Railroad, the weapon of the weak, and people like Tubman and Hester play an outsized role in making those 2 spaces mean different things. So by 1850, this line, which legal scholars will tell you, so borders are legal fictions. But it's meant to be a legal barrier that is enforced, right? That severs the Great Black Way from the north. But Hester and others are using the mountains and valleys to move north. And we're here, Adams County. And one 19th century historian wrote that Williams Wright, York Springs, Pennsylvania, along that line in Adams County, just north of here, his Underground Railroad stop was located near the southern slope of South Mountain, which extends into Tennessee. Hundreds guided by that mountain range northward came into Pennsylvania. So in some respects, though, slavery doesn't really have clear boundaries. But by putting real bite, though, into the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law. So we have a Fugitive Slave Law in the Constitution, another one in 1793, and then 1850. And 1850 is the one that puts the most teeth into it. It blurs the boundaries further, makes the legal line somewhat of a fiction by stretching slavery's reach well past the Mason-Dixon line. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the term slave power, capital S, capital P. Doesn't mean the power of the enslaved. It means the power of the people who own them and their allies. So that slave power is coming into the North, especially with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And sometimes it means conflict to Northerners, like at Christiana, Pennsylvania, 1851. But for Southerners, most Southerners, not all, And I realize I'm talking about the North and the South in monolithic ways. There's great diversity among the white folks in both places. But for many Southerners, the Fugitive Slave Act was supposed to resolve the relationship between federal and state power. So that brings us back to the story of the South Carolina Monument and the stories it tells. So 100 years after the battle, and Jill Titus has a great book on this called Gettysburg, 1963. 100 years after the battle, on July 2nd, 1963, at 4:30 in the afternoon, time to coincide with the day and time 100 years earlier when South Carolinians were preparing to go across on Pickett's charge, George Wallace steps to the podium at the dedication ceremony. What state was Wallace from? Yeah, so he's not even from South Carolina. What's he doing there? Well, what he's doing there is he's telling a lie. So the day before the dedication, Wallace was standing by the Alabama State Monument and said the reason he had famously or infamously now stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama building a month earlier to keep another black woman, Vivian Malone, along with James Hood, from reaching anything approaching equality, he said was, quote, to protect local government. At South Carolina's dedication, Wallace declares that South Carolina, and quote, South Carolina and Alabama stand for constitutional government. Millions throughout the nation look to the South to lead the fight and to restore constitutional rights and the rights of states and individuals, and he gets a standing ovation. And I would argue the reason he gets a standing ovation is because the people who are listening to him, they know what he's done at the University of Alabama a month before, right? They know what he's about. And they know when he says that, he's saying that they are not going to let the federal government or the American public tell them in the South that they have to start treating black citizens as full and equal human beings. He's saying that he's not going to let the federal government give black people the ability to vote. He's not going to let the federal government make sure black children have access to education, or that the federal government can stop killing and lynching black, or tell the states that they can prevent the lynching of black people and murder in the South. And he, along with the South Carolina State Monument, is saying this doesn't have anything to do with slavery. This doesn't have anything to do with race. Doesn't have anything to do with black folks. It's states' rights. So let's take a peek at what South Carolina said in 1860. Oh, I'm going to skip this. This basically is my graph that escaping slaves are actually a pretty small percentage of total slaves. If I can come back to that, about 2.5%. So you're going to have to do some reading here. You'll read faster than I talk, right? So this is from the Declaration of Secession, 1860, South Carolina. So this is how they're setting up their argument. They're saying, well, there was a law compact when we agreed to be part of this country back in 1787 in the Revolutionary era. It was a law compact. And this is what's upsetting them in 1860. Well, not all the states abided by the law compact, which was why we said we'd do this in the first place. And in that declaration, and you should always be a good analytical thinker, check the sources, right? Don't take my word for it. Go online, check it out. They only give one substantive reason or one cause that they say is breaking the law of compact. And it's that these black folks just keep running away. And the states are not holding up their end of the bargain. So in case you can't read the bottom, it says this stipulation was so material to the compact that without it, that compact would not have been made. So in other words, we wouldn't have joined. The greater number of the contracting parties held slaves. But the northern states are not doing what they said. And they even list every state. Right? Not only were they not doing what they said, but they said, in many of these states, the fugitive slave is discharged from service or labor claimed, and in none of them has the state government complied with the stipulation made in the Constitution. So therefore, they're out. Right? And not only the states, they're saying not only these northern states not upholding the compact, they're causing more problems. Abolitionists, black and white, all of these folks, they're encouraging and assisting thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, run away, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. They're going away, but they're thinking about things like David Walker's Appeal from 1829, pamphlets, anti-slavery literature, a whole bunch of stuff there. I'll come back to that. So, this is the story of the Underground Railroad, I would argue, that should be told. This is not simply slavery as an institution. So most historians, any legit historian today, I would argue, would recognize the cause of the Civil War. It all comes back to slavery. That's the message of the museum here. As I told my then, I think, 13-year-old, my youngest son, when we were up top of the tower that I'm about to show you, many, many years ago, when he had just his first year at Gettysburg High School as a ninth grader, and we're standing up there, and I say, man, think, Isaac, if Africans never come to these shores, none of this happens. There's no battle. There's no battlefield. We're not standing on this tower. There's no Civil War. Maybe there's something else that causes a rift, but it's not this. And my own flesh and blood says to me, well, I don't know, Dad. There are these tariffs and states' rights. And I think, you've been in that school for 1 year? And this is what you're telling them? So as I like to say, after I booted him off the tower, went down and picked up his broken and bruised body, and told him, son, you need to understand a different story. It's not just, so it's important to understand it's the institution of slavery, but also it's actual individuals. It's black women, men, and children who decide to resist, who decide, not all of them, it's a small percentage, who run away, who are driving this narrative, who are driving the story. This is the weapon of the week. It is ordinary people making the extraordinary happen. So when you go visit the commemorative landscape, as my colleague Pete Carmichael calls it, AKA the battlefield, go to the Warfield Tower. So the Warfield Tower, anybody else know what it's called? Longstreet Tower. So Christopher Gwynn here had told me a couple of years ago, there's no official thing calling it the Longstreet Tower. James Warfield, the black farmer and blacksmith, owned the land that tower's on. So he said, I'm on a one-man mission to get people to call it the Warfield Tower. I said, let's make it two. Yeah, okay, so how many we got here, right? So call it the Warfield Tower. So if you go up that tower, go up the 121 steps if you can, or stand at the base, take in a little round top, Pickett's Charge, look to the east, the peach orchard, wheat field, the angle, the high water mark, but look to the west too. Because to the west, you see the South Mountain Range tailing off into Maryland. And that story of those mountains is why there's a battle here, why there are monuments here, why there's a tower. And there in those mountains, you see the story of Hester. Okay, so back to Hester. In 1847, she runs away, as I mentioned, from Hagerstown to Carlisle. Her owner and her slave catchers are hot on her trail. And they catch up to her in Carlisle, and they capture her and two others who had come with her. The black residents of Carlisle resist. And they're led by Hester's husband, Norman, and a crowd mostly of black women. So when the slave owner and his deputies, and there's more to this story, when they're transferring Hester from the courtroom out into the wagon, because the court says, yep, she's a fugitive, take her back. So when they are transferring her, that's when the crowd waits and they pounce, and they grab Hester and they take off down the streets. So the slave catcher, the two slave catchers and the slave owner, they chase after, well, it's actually only a few. It's a few in the crowd and Hester, so they're running off. And so the slave catcher and the slave owner chasing them, and then the rest of the crowd of black men and mostly women are chasing the chasers. And they're picking up anything they can get their hands on and throwing it at these slave catchers. Bricks, a stick, rocks, anything they can. And they hit the back of the slave owner, hits him in the back of the head. He falls down. They literally run over him. He suffers some pretty severe injuries, and he actually dies from those injuries a few weeks later. And one of the accounts says Hester's owner was struck repeatedly by the Negroes as they rushed past him. Hester gets away. Don't know what happened to her. She disappears, thankfully. But in the wake of her escape, 28 black defendants and one white lawyer who is assisting them face criminal charges. The prosecuting attorney urges the jury to convict because of the momentous issues He says, which hang upon the result. The rescue of these slaves has rendered the property of every slaveholder insecure. The slaves now think they can get protection and aid from the whites, and their conduct has become marked by insubordination and violence. He says, if you decide these outrages can be committed, the foundations of the government will be broken. This Union States will be rent in twain, and the glare of the Civil War will light up the land. Well, he was right. He wasn't the only one predicting that, but he captured it well. He didn't persuade the court. The defendants were convicted, but they were sentenced to the couple of months they had already spent in jail waiting trial and a $1 fine. But he was right about the outrages, the effect of the outrages. And yet the South Carolina Monument and George Wallace made Hester and thousands of other enslaved black women, men, and children who were escaping to freedom disappear. And they not only make it disappear, but he flips it on its script because the story is right there in the mountains behind the South Carolina Monument. Right behind it is the story that tells you what this monument says is a lie. Because, I would argue the irony here is, when it says it's about states' rights, is if anything, what South Carolina was upset about is that the federal government wasn't doing more to suppress the rights of the northern states. For the thousands of Hesters and their allies, it was the abiding faith in the sacredness of human rights and equality that made them risk their lives for freedom. Why there's a civil war, why a battle at Gettysburg. And I'm not saying that they by themselves pushed the nation to war. There are many factors at the center of the story, but they're part of it. Lincoln is at the center of the story as well, like that statue. The Civil War and emancipation doesn't happen like it does without Lincoln's role. But Frederick Douglass, like he said at the dedication, pointed to another way to think about these stories as emancipation not something that was given to African Americans, but part of a joint effort. When we say that Lincoln freed the slaves, I think it connotes a gift or a grant, like that statue. The action is performed by whoever is the actor, the subject noun of the sentence, right? Lincoln freed the slaves. I take the perspective of Stokely Carmichael. As you may know, Stokely Carmichael, the black leader who coined the phrase Black Power in 1964. 2 years later, he gives a speech at the University of California. And you can listen to this online. He, of course, says it much better than I could. Echoing Douglass, he said, every civil rights bill in this country was passed for white people, not for black people. We must dismiss the fallacious notion that white people can give anybody their freedom. No man can give anybody his freedom. A man is born free. You may enslave a man after he is born free, and that is, in fact, what this country does. It enslaves black people after they're born. So the only act that white people can do is stop denying black people their freedom. They never give it to anyone. Lunsford Lane was a slave in North Carolina who bought his freedom, then had to escape anyway when he was they tried to lynch him. In 1842, he said, to me, God granted freedom which man without God's consent has stolen away. So Stokely Carmichael isn't saying anything that lots of black folks hadn't said for hundreds of years before. So I'm going to finish with, I want you to think about the word rebel. Typically, we think of a rebel as someone who doesn't conform, someone who not simply resists the status quo, but actively fights against it. And I would argue that's actually not what the Confederates were doing. We call them rebels, and they were called rebels at the time. I mean, that's accurate use of the term historically. But they were fighting for a way of life that had characterized most of the New World economy for the previous 200 years. They weren't rebels. George Wallace wasn't rebelling 100 years later when he was fighting to preserve a system of white supremacist racial terrorism. African Americans who fought for liberty and equality from the American Revolution or before, through the Civil War and after, Hester, all the black women and men at the Underground Railroad and their white allies, I would argue they are the real rebels. Like the stories that statues like this tell. This was also 1876 at the Centennial in Philadelphia. It was by an Italian sculptor. And the reports in the newspapers, which were actually pretty racist descriptions of the black folks who went to see it, said black Philadelphians loved this statue. And it's back in Italy. Or like this one of Harriet Tubman. And man, you should go online and look at it. If you haven't seen this, I want to go see this statue because it is a great sculpture of Tubman. But I think these are the real rebels who pushed the nation to war. They were flawed, troubled, complicated, tired, desperate, scared, brave, noble, committed men and women. Black people, not simply slavery, the institution, pushed the nation to war that finally led the country to make real what African Americans already knew: freedom was theirs. So it's time to tell a different national story, to keep telling it, and telling it better and in more places why their stories mattered. It's time for freedom to win the Civil War. So let's be a Sankofa people. And win the war for freedom. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Hancock. We certainly appreciate it. Very thought-provoking. Thank you.